The kitchen was quiet, but the air felt heavy. Linda sat alone at the table, the plastic keys of the calculator clicking under her thumb. She entered the last of the figures. Her finger hovered over the equals sign for a long moment before she pressed it. The screen flickered, then held the final sum. It was not just a total, it was a verdict. She stared at the digits, the light from the overhead lamp reflecting off the small screen. The numbers sat there, cold and rigid, defining the boundaries of her next decade. She did not look away. She counted the zeros, then the digits that followed, checking them twice against the ledger in her notebook. Every digit confirmed the same reality. There was no cushion. There was no safety net. She exhaled slowly, the sound thin in the empty room. She pushed the calculator aside, the movement deliberate, and rested her palms flat against the wood of the table. The silence of the house pressed against her windows, but she kept her gaze fixed on the paper. She was 53, and the math was absolute. She stood up, walked to the window, and looked out at the dark street, watching a single car pass by while the weight of the calculation settled deep into her chest. She turned back to the notebook. The ink on the pages was a map of years spent in service to others. She remembered the early mornings, packing lunches and managing the chaotic rhythm of 3 children before the sun rose. She remembered the late-night calls from the office, solving crises that threatened to collapse the household budget. There had been decades of firefighting, of redirecting every spare dollar toward tuition and emergency repairs. Each entry in the notebook represented a sacrifice made in the name of stability. She flipped through the pages, seeing the dates and the problems she had solved. But the last page was blank. She traced the edge of the paper with her thumb. The contrast was sharp. The effort she had poured into the world for 30 years had left no trace in the columns of her current account. She looked at the kitchen walls, realizing the quiet was not merely an absence of noise, but a reflection of her own depletion. She had spent a lifetime building a foundation for others, and now, standing in the center of that work, she found the ground beneath her own feet was hollow. She tapped the notebook, the sound echoing against the wood, a hollow rhythm that matched the reality of the numbers on the screen. She stood up and walked to the kitchen pantry. She opened the door, staring at the rows of canned goods and dry staples, calculating their value, then closed it. There was nothing else. She walked to the hallway, checking the mail stack on the console table, flipping through envelopes that held only bills and flyers. She returned to the kitchen and sat back down, the chair creaking in the stillness. She looked at the bank statement again, her eyes tracking the lines of debits. She sought a mistake, a forgotten account, an error in the math that might shift the total. She checked the numbers against her notebook for a 3rd time. The result remained identical. 0 pension, no emergency fund, no safety net. The house felt larger than it had an hour ago, the walls retreating into shadows. She felt the air move through the room, cool and indifferent. She was 53, and the world had suddenly narrowed to the dimensions of this kitchen table. She looked at her hands, resting them on the wood, feeling the grain beneath her skin. There was nowhere to turn. The exposure was absolute. Every decision she had made for 3 decades now sat in this single, silent room, stripped of its protective layers. She did not move as the sun dipped below the horizon, leaving her in the growing gray of the evening. Linda cleared the table, pushing the empty notebook aside to make room for a growing stack of financial articles. She had spent the last week printing them, highlighting phrases and circling advice that never seemed to apply to her. She read the first headline, "The power of compounding starts at 20. She moved to the next, "How to retire by 40. Her pen scratched hard against the margins. Every page contained the same insistent, biting refrain. "You started too late." She felt the paper slick under her fingertips as she flipped through the charts. The logic was cold, precise, and entirely dismissive of her timeline. She stood up, paced the length of the kitchen, and returned to the table, desperate for a different conclusion. She pulled another article from the pile, scanning for a loophole, a strategy for someone in their 50s, but found only empty space. The articles were a chorus of exclusion. She pressed her palms into the tabletop, feeling the hard surface beneath her as the words began to blur together. Each article felt like a door being shut in her face. The panic was no longer a quiet thought. It was a physical weight, a constriction in her chest that forced her to stand, walk to the window, and breathe in the cold air of the street, trying to find a rhythm that didn't sync with the ticking clock on the wall. She returned to the laptop, the screen light casting a harsh, artificial glow across her face. She pulled up a series of interactive investment models. She clicked through the options, searching for a toggle that would acknowledge her age, but every menu defaulted to a starting point of 22. She watched the lines on the monitor. They climbed in steep, elegant curves, representing decades of exponential growth. She tried to drag the anchor point, to force the graph to bend toward her reality, but the digital lines snapped back to their original, youthful trajectory. It was a visual language she could not speak. She felt like a ghost, an entity that simply did not exist within these calculated projections. She leaned in, her eyes tracing the steep ascent of the lines. Realizing that her life was not even a variable in these equations, she tapped the mouse, refreshing the page, hoping for a different result, but the numbers remained identical, cold and indifferent to her presence. She pushed the laptop away, the friction of the metal base against the table sounding like a final, sharp dismissal. She was staring at a world designed for a future she had already lived past. The screen went dark, and for a moment, the only thing visible in the reflection was her own face, unmapped and outside the frame. Linda sat in the silence, the dark laptop screen still reflecting her own stillness. She reached for a book she had pulled from a dusty shelf earlier that day, a worn volume by Napoleon Hill. She had kept it for years, unopened, a relic of a different version of herself. She held the spine, feeling the texture of the aged paper, and wondered if it would hold anything more than empty formulas for success she could no longer reach. She opened the cover. The pages were yellowed, smelling of trapped time. She expected dry, clinical advice, the same rigid math that had defined her previous weeks. Her thumb brushed the edge of the paper as she turned to a random chapter. She began to read, her eyes tracking the lines with a habitual skepticism. Then, she stopped. Her breath hitched, a sharp intake of air that broke the stagnant quiet of the kitchen. She lowered the book, the weight of the words pressing into her palms. She read the sentence again, slower this time, letting the ink ground her. The starting point of all achievement is desire. The rhythm of the words felt entirely different from the sterile charts she had been studying. She sat motionless, the book open on her lap, the heavy silence of the kitchen now feeling less like a cage and more like a space waiting for an instruction. She read the sentence a second time, the letters anchoring themselves into her mind. Then a third. She looked away from the page, staring at the blank wall, and let the words rotate in her thoughts. Was it that simple? For weeks, she had treated her 53 years as a locked door, a mathematical impossibility that barred her from any new beginning. She whispered the word desire to the empty kitchen, testing the weight of it against the heavy, familiar narrative of her own limitations. The realization hit her with the force of a physical blow. The age was not the wall. The wall was the conviction that she had already reached her destination. She had been treating her existence as a finished product rather than a project in flux. She stood up, the chair scraping sharply against the floor, and looked at her hands. They were the same hands that had navigated decades of change, yet she had been using them only to count what she lacked. She saw the cage now, not as a structure built by time, but as a perimeter she had drawn around herself, brick by brick, with every thought of being too old. She gripped the book, the leather pressing into her skin, and felt the sudden, terrifying clarity of a choice. The cage was not locked. She had simply forgotten she held the key. Linda turned toward the kitchen table, where the financial articles lay scattered like debris. She swept them into a pile, the sound of paper sliding against wood sharp and purposeful. She did not throw them away, but she pushed them to the edge, out of her immediate focus. The mourning for the decades she had lost felt suddenly like an anchor, one she was finally ready to cut. She sat back down, taking a clean sheet of paper. She began to list not her deficits, but her inventory. She wrote down the resilience she had forged through years of household crises. She noted the work ethic that had carried her through countless shifts and layoffs. She analyzed her own history, not as a ledger of what she lacked, but as a collection of hard-won skills. She realized she possessed a capacity to adapt that was sharper and more battle-tested than anything she could have learned at 20. Her pen moved steadily across the paper, capturing these hidden assets one by one. She was no longer counting what was gone. She was assessing what remained. The kitchen, once a space of suffocating silence, now felt like a command center. She was not just starting over. She was starting with a lifetime of hidden experience as her foundation. The list on the table grew, a roadmap written in blue ink. Linda paused, tapping the pen against her chin. She looked at the column marked adaptability and circled it twice. For years, she had viewed her history of navigating layoffs and household emergencies as proof of her struggle. Now, she redefined them. They were not just obstacles. They were training grounds. She had learned how to dismantle a crisis into manageable parts, how to stay calm when the floor dropped out, and how to pivot when the rules changed overnight. She turned her attention to the fear that had kept her paralyzed for months. She wrote "fear" at the top of a new column, then drew a line through it. Replacing the header with risk management, she mapped out how her caution could serve her, transforming her hesitation into a tool for vetting bad investments. Every entry she made stripped away the weight of the past and replaced it with a tactical advantage. She leaned back, the chair groaning under her weight, and scanned the page. The list was not a wish. It was a ledger of capabilities. She felt the knot in her chest finally begin to loosen. The fear was still there, but it no longer held the pen. She did. The clock on the wall ticked with a hollow, rhythmic insistence. Linda sat alone, the list of her capabilities laid out before her under the sharp hum of the overhead light. As the hour climbed past midnight, the silence began to sharpen. Her mind reached for the familiar, comforting weight of her old anxieties, whispering that the plan was too simple, that the odds were too steep. She felt a sharp, cold pull in her gut, the fear trying to reclaim its territory. She gripped the edge of the table until her knuckles turned pale, anchoring herself against the urge to crumple the paper and go back to sleep. She looked at her own handwriting, the evidence of her intent. She breathed in, slowly, feeling the air fill her lungs with a new, sharp clarity. The doubt was a ghost, and she was the one with the physical form. She pushed the list toward the center of the table, making space for her hands to rest. Her heart hammered against her ribs, not with the rhythm of panic, but with the pressure of a coiled spring. She stared into the dark window, watching her own reflection. She was no longer waiting for a sign. She was the sign. The morning would be the first test, and for the first time in years, she was ready to meet it. The morning air was sharp, biting at her face as Linda walked toward the bank. The streets were quiet, save for the distant rumble of the city waking up. She kept her fingers tight around the envelope in her pocket. It was not a fortune. It was a fraction of what she had once thought she needed, but it was hers. She reached the glass doors and stopped. The reflection of the bank caught her eye, a sterile, imposing glass facade. For 3 seconds, her breath hitched. Her mind replayed every reason why this was futile, why the numbers were too small to matter. She stepped forward anyway, the heavy door swinging open with a metallic click. Inside, the carpet muffled her footsteps as she approached the counter. She handed the teller the envelope. Her hand did not shake. As the transaction completed, a machine printed a slip, the thermal paper humming as it emerged. She took the receipt, the ink still fresh, and looked at the new balance. It was a modest entry, but it represented a wall breached. She turned and stepped back into the street. The sun had crested the buildings, casting long, sharp shadows across the sidewalk. She did not hurry. She kept her pace steady, moving with the weight of a woman who had finally begun to build. Back at her kitchen table, the atmosphere felt different. The space was no longer a site of mourning, but a command center. Linda cleared the surface, laying out her bank statements, utility bills, and grocery receipts in overlapping columns. She picked up a red pen. Her hand moved with rhythmic, mechanical intent. She crossed out the daily coffee shop run, then the premium cable package, then the subscription services she had not touched in a year. Each stroke of the pen was a physical release of weight. When she reached the entertainment budget, her resolve faltered, a momentary pull of nostalgia for the small comforts she had taken for granted. She stared at the total, closed her eyes, and then slashed through the line with a single, brutal motion. She calculated the monthly overflow, the exact currency she would redirect toward her savings, and set the automated transfer to trigger at dawn. The plan was not just numbers. It was a blueprint for her survival. She typed the final sequence into her laptop, the keys clicking with sharp finality. She pushed the ledger aside, the surface now clean. The kitchen felt larger, stripped of the excess that had been suffocating her. She had mapped the path ahead, and for the first time, every digit was under her control. When the sun dipped below the horizon, the kitchen transitioned into a sanctuary of study. Linda cleared the remnants of her dinner, set a physical timer on the table, and opened a textbook on market fundamentals. The first week, the jargon felt like a foreign language. She read sentences 3 or 4 times, her brow furrowing, her pen hovering over the margin. She hit a wall on compound interest formulas. The logic seemed to slip away every time she tried to anchor it. She did not close the book. Instead, she grabbed a scratch pad and began drawing the progression by hand, line by line, until the math aligned with the reality of her own savings. Her eyes ached under the yellow light, but the resistance was fading. She replaced exhaustion with the sharp, focused energy of a student. Every evening, she dissected a new concept: asset allocation, inflation impact, tax implications, treating each page as a fortress to be conquered. The timer would chime, signaling the end of her 60 minutes, but she often stayed, tracing the data until the patterns became second nature. Her posture straightened. Her reading became faster. She was no longer just reading about wealth. She was dismantling the mechanisms that had kept her in the dark. She closed the book, the sound echoing in the quiet room, and marked her progress in the ledger. The screen glimmered with the successes of others. Linda navigated through financial forums where users half her age posted screenshots of aggressive portfolios and early life windfalls. A familiar tension tightened in her chest. She scrolled through a thread about rapid compounding, her pulse quickening as she measured their progress against her own modest, slow-growth reality. The numbers on their screens felt like a judgment on her own timeline. She felt the urge to analyze their strategies, to see if she could replicate their pace, but the attempt only stirred a deep, corrosive sense of inadequacy. Her hands hovered over the trackpad, trembling slightly. She watched her own reflection in the dark monitor, looking at a woman who had once let the shadow of others dictate her worth. She refused to yield to that habit again. With a sharp, sudden movement, she slammed the laptop shut. The sound was flat and final. The room went dark, save for the overhead light. She pushed the device away to the edge of the table, leaving it there like a discarded obstacle. She took a long, steady breath, clearing the noise of the digital world from her mind. Purpose was the only metric that mattered now. She turned back to her own ledger, focusing entirely on the next line of her own plan. By 55, the bank balance had climbed, but the change in her physical presence was far more striking. She moved through the world with a different rhythm. Where she once navigated grocery aisles or office corridors with a hurried, apologetic gait, she now walked with steady, measured intent. She kept her head up, her eyes scanning the environment with newfound clarity. When the city streets grew crowded, she no longer pivoted to avoid every collision. She held her line, adjusting her pace with a fluid, confident grace that demanded space. Her breathing was deeper, centered in her chest rather than the shallow, anxious inhalations of her former self. At work, she handled sudden deadlines not with the frantic energy of a woman scrambling to stay afloat, but with the quiet, tactical focus of an architect. She reached for documents, organized her desk, and addressed colleagues with a stillness that settled the room around her. She was not rushing to catch up to a phantom timeline. She was setting her own. Every motion was deliberate. Stripped of the hesitation that had defined her previous years, she stood taller, grounded in the reality of her own progress, and navigated her days with the quiet, undeniable authority of someone who had finally taken the wheel. The office was quiet, save for the rhythmic clicking of keyboards. Linda was deep in a spreadsheet, her focus centered on the final columns of her quarterly review. A chair skidded against the linoleum floor beside her. She did not look up immediately, keeping her pen moving until the last figure was entered. A younger coworker leaned over the partition, eyes fixed on Linda with a blend of curiosity and hesitation. The coworker tapped a finger against the edge of the desk. "I was looking at the company records," the younger woman said, her voice dropping to a conversational pitch. "You started your major investments at 53. I have to ask, weren't you absolutely terrified to start that late?" The question hung in the air, sharp and unvarnished. Linda stopped her pen. She slowly set it down on the blotter. the sound of the plastic hitting the wood audible in the sudden stillness of the workspace. She turned her chair, the wheels rolling smoothly across the floor. She did not blink. She did not look away. She locked her gaze onto the younger woman, her expression unreadable and entirely steady. The environment around them seemed to flatten, the hum of the air conditioner fading into the background. She took a breath, held it for a beat, and let the silence stretch until the coworker shifted uncomfortably in her seat. Linda tilted her head, her gaze remaining fixed and heavy. She did not rush the response. She allowed the question to settle between them, letting the younger woman feel the full weight of her own inquiry. "Fear is not an obstacle you clear once," Linda said, her voice low and even, stripped of any defensive tremor. "Fear is a constant. It is the background noise of every significant change." She tapped the desk with a single finger to emphasize the rhythm of her speech. "The difference is not whether you feel it or not. The difference is whether you let fear make your decisions for you, or you make them yourself." The younger woman blinked, her hand dropping from the partition. She looked down at her own desk, then back at Linda, clearly searching for a more conventional, softer answer. She found none. Linda picked up her pen again, the movement sharp and dismissive of the tension. She turned back to her screen, her posture rigid and focused. The conversation was finished. The younger woman lingered for a heartbeat, then slowly retreated, her own movements suddenly hesitant compared to the deliberate, controlled energy that now defined Linda's space. Years passed, and the ledger on her desk grew thick with entries. Linda sat by the window in the late afternoon, the light hitting the pages of her final audit. The numbers were no longer a verdict of failure, but a testament to a decade of rigid, automated discipline. She scanned the columns. The growth was steady, deliberate, and entirely her own. She did not possess a fortune, but she possessed something far more functional. She closed the binder, the sound of the thick cover snapping shut echoing in the quiet room. She stood up, her movements fluid and unhurried, and walked to the window to look out at the street below. She watched the neighbors rushing toward their own appointments, their pace erratic and hurried. She felt the difference in her own pulse. The financial buffer she had constructed was substantial enough to stop the panic that once defined her mornings. She reached out and touched the glass, feeling the cool surface against her palm. The security she had built was not just in the bank. It was in the way she stood, the way she moved, and the way she knew that no sudden shift in the world could strip her of her choices again. She had traded the fear of the future for the certainty of her own agency. Linda looked at the stacks of financial records on her desk, the paper yellowing slightly at the edges. For years, these pages had been her only metric for survival. She gathered them into a single pile, their weight familiar and heavy in her hands. She set them aside, the sudden lack of clutter on the table surface striking. The currency in her bank was a line on a statement, but it was not the wealth she had actually accrued. She walked to the center of the room and stood still, feeling the floorboards beneath her feet. The real capital was the internal map she had drawn. She had learned to pivot when the ground shifted, to absorb loss without collapsing, and to calculate risks with a steady hand. She realized that any circumstance, a layoff, a market crash, a sudden crisis, was now just another variable she could solve. She reached out and gripped the back of her chair, feeling the solid wood. Her grip was firm, deliberate, and entirely calm. Quote, she had spent decades believing her life was a series of events happening to her. Now, she understood that her life was the result of the decisions she made in the face of those events. The numbers were just the byproduct. The mastery was the prize. Linda picked up the small plastic calculator that had once sat on her kitchen table years ago. It felt light, almost hollow, in her palm. She set it down in the trash bin, hearing the sharp clatter against the plastic base. The silence that followed was not the heavy, suffocating weight she had known at 53. It was the quiet of a room where the debate had finally ended. She walked to the window and watched the day transition into dusk. The past had explained the present. It had shaped the woman she became through the grind of those early, uncertain years. But it held no power to dictate the chapters yet to be written. She leaned her forehead against the glass, watching the streetlights flicker on one by one. Her history was a map, not a set of instructions. She had rebuilt her life one habit at a time, proving that momentum is a choice made in the present. She turned away from the window, the room behind her bright and organized. She was finished looking back. The future was not a destination she was waiting to arrive at. It was a structure she would continue to build, day by day, with every decision that followed.